Good afternoon, everybody. Well, y'all don't sound sure. Welcome to the University of Louisville Leigh and Conn Prize for Renewable Energy Lecture Series. Our guest today is Professor Martin Green. Martin Green was born in Brisbane, Australia, and educated at the University of Queensland and McMaster University in Canada. After completing his PhD at McMaster, he joined the University of New South Wales, Sydney, where he is now a Scientia Professor and the founding director of the Australian Centre for Advanced Photovoltaics, involving 5 other Australian universities and research groups. His group's contributions to photovoltaics include conception and first demonstration of both PERC and TOPCon solar cells, now accounting for over 90% of global production and the most solar installed in the field. His team has held the record for silicon energy conversion efficiency for 3 of the last 4 decades. Regarded as a top 10 milestone in solar voltaics history, since this began in 1839 with Edward Becquerel's observation of the photovoltaic effect. Major international awards include the 1999 Australian Prize, the 2021 Japan Prize, the 2022 Millennium Technology Prize, and the 2023 Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering. Through his work, he has been credited with having done, quote, more to help ward off impending climate disaster than any other single person. It is my pleasure to present the University of Louisville's Leigh and Conn Prize for Renewable Energy 2023 Laureate, Professor Martin Green.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew. It's of course a great honor to be awarded the Leigh and Conn Prize for Renewable Energy, and I want to acknowledge the Conn family, the late Hank and Rebecca Conn in particular, for establishing and supporting this award in memory of their daughter, Leanne. What I'd like to talk to you about today is the story of solar's success and the role that our team at the University of New South Wales has played in supporting that success. And on that first slide there, you can see the iconic Sydney Opera House, close to where our university is located. And then the center one just sort of shows our research building, solar powered, of course, within the university's campus. And the third photo is our solar industrial research facility, where we do technology transfer to industry and support the development of equipment for manufacturing within the industry. So my talk's got 3 bits to it. So first of all, I'll talk about the technology, and then the important issue of the costs of solar, and then their role in climate change mitigation. So a little bit about the technology. Like, solar is very, very definitely a technology for the 21st century, but the science that underpins it was only developed in the 20th century, and it all started with Albert Einstein here, who, after, I guess, a century of it being proved that, light was a wave, sort of had the courage to suggest that light might indeed have particulate type properties as well. And, that was the birth of the concept of photons. So in its interaction with matter, light can be regarded as particles being belted at you from the sun, and they have different colors indicative of their energy. And the energy is actually measured in electron volts, which is a very convenient unit, because you can see on that diagram on the right there, the photons in sunlight, that just shows the distribution of the number of photons, and there's zillions of them in total. They're centered around 1 or 2 electron volts of energy. So it's a very convenient unit because it expresses the voltage in, it expresses the energy in a unit that's, measures the quantity in simple, quantitative terms. But the other interesting thing is that when you're dealing with a solar cell, it's indicative of the maximum voltage you can get from a cell. So you can see the visible spectrum there, the red photons, you know, with 1.5 to 2 electron volts energy. If you want to convert them with a solar cell, you're never going to get more than 1.5 voltage out of it. You know, that's just from the basis of energy conservation. So a very convenient unity on that account. So I'm sure most people in the audience are familiar with a solar cell, but I'll just quickly go over it in case some are not. But these photons strike the cell and they give up their energy, exciting electrons from some of the bonds holding the silicon atoms together, or whatever other material you're using, excites them to states where the electrons are mobile within the material. And then the vacancies that are left behind also play their role in that electrons that are in nearby bonds can move into those vacant states. So the vacancies move as well, much like the way a bubble moves through a liquid. So you have these two different types of carriers, electrons and holes, that are generated by a single photon with enough energy. And the solar cell is designed to get the electrons to move off in one direction and the holes in the other. So this particular cell here, which is indicative of the state of the art when I joined the field in the early 1970s, it has dopants introduced into the silicon material, so impurities that control the electronic properties. So the light blue region is a region that electrons can move through easily, so electrons tend to go up through that region. The dark green is one where electrons find it difficult to move through, but holes can move through that easily. So that gives you the asymmetry that means electrons go up, holes go down, and then if you connect a load between the top and the back contacts, the electrons flow through the load, complete the circuit, and meet up with a hole at the back contact. And in that way, you get the energy in the photon converted to electrical power dissipated in the load. The cells are very brittle, so only nowadays, a sixth of a millimeter thick, so really very thin. And so if I passed one around this group here, it wouldn't reach me back in one piece. Hundreds of little bits, so very fragile. So they're encapsulated into modules. Glass provides the main structural support, reinforced by an aluminium frame. And then the whole package is melded together by using heat to meld the encapsulating materials together into this really solid, tight little package known as a solar module. And the packaging, provides mechanical support for the brittle cells and also chemical protection. The cells themselves are quite rugged, but chemically, but the metallization and so on can be prone to corrosion by moisture, so you want to keep moisture out of the module as much as you can. And so it provides chemical protection. And then these cells are, even though their voltage, as I mentioned before, is determined by the photon energy, so, a volt is a, typical type of amount of voltage generated by each cell. You keep connecting them in series to build up that voltage, and you can, most systems now are working, big systems are working at 1,500 volts. So the other purpose of the packaging is to provide protection from those lethal voltages. So over the last, the history of solar cell has been one of ongoing development that I'll touch upon. But over the last, 9 years, there's been quite spectacular advances in these modules, the way they look and the way they perform. So on the left there is shown a module typical of 2015. The squares are the cells are square, and the module is about 16% efficient. And then if you look at modern modules, they're a lot bigger, as you can see. So now they're 8 foot tall and about half that in width, as you can see there. So really, grown quite a bit. And the cells are now rectangular. That's just to reduce the path that the current the cell collects has to carry across the cell. And because the wafers used now in fabrication are much bigger, it limits the amount of current each cell generates to keep that to manageable levels, because the cells are basically a low voltage, high current device, and people talk about solar painting walls and everything, but if I painted something the size of that screen, you'd be generating thousands of amps current, so it'd be really difficult to handle it. So you've got to keep the size of each individual cell fairly compact to keep the current below 10 amps, which is sort of where you start running into problems needing more and more copper to handle it. So the other thing is the back of the modules. So on the left you can see the back of a module, only a little while ago was covered with an intransparent sheet, whereas now on the far right, that's looking at the back of it, the module behind, and looks pretty much the same as the front. So the modules are designed now to collect light from both directions, which gives you a boost in output at no extra cost, essentially. So those big modules there, the one's 8 foot tall, 8 foot's about the length of a horse. I've seen plenty of drawings, photographs, and statues of horses in the 2 days that I've been in Louisville. But 8 foot's about the length of a horse, and these modules are about the same surface area as a horse, but they weigh 30 or 40 times less than a horse. But these big modules generate about 1 horsepower in peak sunlight. So, and I guess during a day they'll do about the same work as a healthy horse could do. So that just gives you an idea of the power that you'd pent up within these modules. Just interesting that they're now that rating. So the modern silicon cell was first made in late 1953 and reported in 1954 at Bell Labs here in the US, and a photo there of the team that did that work. But perhaps fitting in view of the role that solar is going to play in our energy future, it made front page news on the New York Times when that discovery was reported. So vast power of the sun is tapped by battery using sand ingredient. And then there was photos or drawings released with that press release that showed how this family was going to be able to tap into the energy of the solar panels and so on. But the cells were far too, I forgot to start my timer. Go. It's away. So the cells were far too expensive to be used for those type of applications that were indicated there, like over 1,000 times too expensive. But fortunately, almost immediately, application was found on satellites. So the second US satellite to go up, that was Vanguard 1 in 1958, the fourth worldwide. Some of the proponents of solar managed to get cells incorporated onto it, and they worked really well. And so when communication satellites started to be developed in the 1960s, the solar cells were the natural source of energy for them, and that provided the industry that was built up to supply cells for that use. But as I said, they were very expensive, but their lightweight was the feature that made them attractive for satellites. And the chart, the center there, just sort of shows the historical development of cell efficiency, with all these results being done in the US, initially at Bell Labs, and then some of the commercial operations, and military ones, developed to exploit the cell's capabilities in space, push the efficiency up. And then in the 1970s, when I joined the field, ComSat Lab was set up to improve space cell technology, and they looked at the solar cells as one of the things they thought they could improve, and they did. So when I joined the field, the best cells were just under 17% efficient by present standards, based on the cell structure shown there at the upper left. There's two features incorporated there that were quite new in that era, and one is the pyramids you can see on the top surface. They're exactly the same geometry as those as Giza, but like millions of times smaller, but they're formed by intersecting crystal planes in the silicon. So it was a similar technique had been developed for microelectronics, and then someone realized they could apply it to the solar cells. And then the other feature is this P+ region that you can see at the back of the cell there. And that was there essentially to make it even harder for electrons to get to that back contact. So that was an improvement that was introduced in the late 60s, early 70s, that was incorporated into this cell, which gave a big jump in performance, those two features combined. And then just about the same time, also in the US at Spectralab, one of the space cell manufacturers, this screen printing technique for applying the metal contacts to the cell was developed. And just like printing patterns on t-shirts, you screen print the metal paste and end up with the pattern, dry it out, and you have this conductive metal contact. Much simpler process than was used for the space cells. So that formed a cell structure that was known as the aluminium back surface field solar cell, that represented the state of the art in the early 70s. And that was really important because the next 40 years it completely dominated commercial production of the cells. So it was representative of the best possible technology there in the 1970s. And at the same time, as a result of the Yom Kippur War, the oil embargoes in the US and other countries like Australia started, and that put an emphasis on developing other sources of energy for terrestrial use. And the companies, some employees of the companies involved in producing the cells for spacecraft managed to convince the powers that be that we could reduce the cost of these solar cells by 1,000 times and make a cheap energy source for terrestrial use from them. So they managed to sell that story, and they were right, but it's taken a lot longer than the 10 years they thought they'd need to make that happen. I did my studies here in Canada, as Andrew mentioned, but joined the University of New South Wales just after finishing my PhD in 1974. So this is my 50th anniversary at the university. I now claim to be the oldest serving professor there, and no one's ever argued against me, so I think I'm right. But that's me early in my career there with my first PhD student, who also went on to play a big role in the energy industry in Australia. But what I studied during my PhD was tunneling in metal oxide silicon structures. So the Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded in 1971 for work to three researchers that had been working on tunneling in various applications. So, it was a pretty hot topic in that era, and my PhD thesis involved in investigating possible device applications of this structure, and one of them I hit upon was photovoltaics. So when I got to the university, I sort of started a project to explore the full potential of this structure for solar. And fortunately for us, NASA also started a program about the same time to try and improve the performance of space cells. So their study showed that what the cells were lacking was the voltage is limited by the energy of the photons that goes in to something like a volt, but the practical cells were only giving about half of that in their voltage output. So they figured we've got to get closer to that ideal voltage output from the cell. So they identified improving the voltage of the cell as what they should be concentrating on to improve the performance. So they set up a program. We weren't initially funded under it, but we managed to beat NASA and all their subcontractors in terms of improving the voltage, as the chart there shows. So we sort of streaked ahead of them, taking the voltage from about 0.6 of a volt to 0.7 of a volt, which doesn't sound like much, but that translates to a 16% improvement in efficiency, if you are able to capture it. So everyone said, well, these metal oxide semiconductor tunneling structures are great, but as soon as you heat them up, the metal's going to attack the oxide and eat through it. So we said, oh, well, we can get around that. We'll use doped polysilicon instead of the metal, because the polysilicon is not going to interact with the oxide the way a metal does. And that structure proved very important because, like I think from this year on, that'll be the dominant commercial structure. So we made our first one of those in 1981 and set a record for the voltages outside our lab. So this, all this work got us international attention because everyone was interested in the voltage improvements, and we were streaking ahead of everyone else. So it allowed me to raise money to try and convert our lab infrastructure, which was pretty basic, as you might observe from the photo there, to allow us to convert these voltage outputs to improve cell performance. And we managed to do that in 1983, and that's the small team that was involved in doing it, using the structure shown in the drawing there. But you can see some of our nice, shiny new equipment in the background there that our earlier work in improving the voltage had allowed us to purchase. So we set our first record in 1983, and we got a big jump in performance over where ComSat had got. We got over 18% there, and the little red diamonds in the chart on the red show what we're able to do over the next 30 years. So we took that, sub 17% efficiency and took it up to 25%, which is a 50% relative improvement in this technology that already had quite substantial development, 40 years of prior development, and enhanced by the focus on the cells for the space program and so on. So we used that tunneling approach in our first record device, and then we hit upon another way of making high voltage devices, and that was just by reducing the contact area of the cells, a much simpler approach. And we got our second world record the same year just by restricting the area of contact to the cell. And then I did a theoretical paper that looked at the limits on silicon cell performance, which in that era was thought to be, 20% was about as far as you're ever going to get with a silicon cell, with 17% being the best that had been done. But I did a theoretical study that suggested 29 to 30% was where the limit lay. So we set ourselves a target of 25%, and I sketched out a couple of structures that might be able to do it. One used this tunneling structure on both sides, and the other one used the small area contacts, and that's now known as the PERC solar cell, passivated, emitter, and rear. Emitter just means top in solar cell jargon, so just a solar cell that had the top and the back fixed up, particularly in relation to the contacting and other surface properties. So that got us our second record and got us over 19%. So we were on the hunt now to get to the first 20% efficient cell, and we did that in 1985. And that's the team that achieved that result. So many of those people in that photo have gone on to play a major role in the industry. Certain gender imbalance, but we soon fixed that with Adele and Shimin and Awa joining us. These people were involved in actually developing the PERC cell efficiency and taking it through to that 25% limit. So since then, there's been 4 structures that have got over that 25% value, and they're shown in that diagram there. So the first one is the PERC, which really based on small area contacts to minimise the impact upon the contact on the cell structure. So that was the vehicle for our efficiency improvement. And then the second structure is the TopCon structure, which uses this tunneling approach just on the rear at the moment, but you could use it for both polarities, which was our original concept. That's the second technology. And then heterojunction, which was actually inspired by our work on these tunneling structures, but using a low temperature variation of them by depositing these layers at low temperature onto the surface. And then the interdigitated back contact structure shown there at the bottom, which has both of the polarity contacts on the rear. So that's in fact the oldest structure of those suggested structures there, being suggested in 1976, and the later ones were suggested after 1981. The efficiency limit, like the US held the record for the first 40 years of development, we held it for the next 30. Japan held it for 8 years, and now China has taken over for reasons that I'll explain during my talk. So the present efficiency limit is 27.1. The efficiency result is 27.1. and the 29 to 30% efficiency has now been refined to 29.4% is the value that's most highly regarded for the limiting efficiency of silicon cell. But if we look at what's happening commercially, this chart here just sort of shows it all in one shot. And the 100% is the 100% of the market, and the blue and blue and light brown regions sort of show the market share of that aluminium back surface technology that was developed here in the US in the mid-1970s. And it dominated the market right through, past 2015, so over 40 years. So it was really a very rugged, technology, and it used the best approaches that have been developed by the mid-1970s. And then it's showing like black here, black and yellow regions started taking over from about 2016. Well, they started appearing about 2015, 2016, and very quickly took over the market. And that's partly because the manufacturing volume of solar cells is growing very quickly. It's doubling every 3 years. So that if a new technology comes along and all the new capacity is installed with that technology, it only takes about 3 years to get up to 50% of the production. And that's what happened with the PERC technology. It very quickly took over and got to over 90% of the market share. And then now the orange region is starting to emerge, and that's this TOPCon technology. So maybe 25, 30% of the market. This year it'll get to over 50%, and then it'll slowly, probably quickly displace PERC as suggested there. And I think that back contact structure at the bottom, it has the advantage that there's no shading of the top of the cell by one of the contact polarities. I think that'll be the winner for silicon. Over this decade, we'll see that displace these double-sided contacts that have been used commercially up to now, as the standard. This just shows how the market has grown over the last decade or more. And so the blue is the actual growth. And last year was sort of a bumpy year. The market grew by 66% according to Bloomberg, whose figures I like best of what I see published, to over 444 gigawatts is the official value. But if you just do a relatively modest projection of that based on past experience, you can see by over the next 4 years, you'll get to 1,000 gigawatts, which is 1 terawatt per year of actual, this is solar installed actually, these figures of solar installed per year. And as we'll see, that's quite a significant figure. And because over recent years, PERC has completely dominated the market, even though it's only been, a factor in the market for, a very short period since 2016, say, there's by far more PERC modules installed worldwide now than any other solar technology in the history of the human race. And that includes things like power towers and, all kinds of, solar thermal electric systems as well that, have been around since the 19th century. But where's solar going? Like the ultimate embodiment of solar is to stack cells from different materials on top of one another. And that's to do with what I mentioned before. If you convert a photon with 1.5 electron volts energy, you can't get more than 1.5 volts out of it. But if you specialize cells for converting different energies, the photons, you can increase the net voltage output. So if you have a cell that responds well to blue photons that might have 3 electron volts of energy, your voltage limit then bumps up to, you can't get more than 3 volts out of that from energy conservation point of view. You're never going to get 3, but you're going to get some fraction of 3 out of it. So if you stack cells on top of one another with their absorption threshold steadily decreasing as you go through the stack, the top cell will absorb the high energy photons, but it'll just look like glass, to the lower energy photons. They'll just pass straight through to the next one. So it's really neat the way you get this automatic filtering of the sunlight so that the photons with the right energy end up in the cell with the best ability to convert them. So the chart on the lower right there just sort of shows what type of boost you can expect from that. The green bars just show if you limit yourself to silicon as a bottom cell, and it turns out that's not too bad a choice. And the red just shows the best you can do with, any dream material you want to think of. And silicon's not a bad choice for a single cell. 29%, as I said, is the limiting efficiency. 33% is the best you could do with your dream material. In production, manufacturers are doing over 25% now. So you're getting a fair fraction of that fundamental limit. But as you start stacking the cells, the efficiency limit goes up, and stack 2 cells onto silicon, you get to the far right of that chart. You can get efficiencies up to, I think it's 47%, if I remember right. If you take a reasonable fraction of that as what you can do commercially, you're looking at cells that are probably over 40% efficient. So that's the type of efficiency I think is practically feasible once you start this stacking approach. The problem has been finding a suitable material to stack onto silicon. So silicon's sort of like the ideal photovoltaic material in that it's abundant, only oxygen is more abundant in the Earth's crust. It's, I can't see, it's just a blur on my screen here. It's abundant, it's non-toxic, it's stable, and it gives you efficiency over 20%. So, these solar cells are made from semiconductors, and there must be at least 10,000 semiconductors that have been identified and known, but only 7 of them have got efficiency over 20%. So finding material that gives efficiency over 20% is not a trivial task. There's only 7 materials that have been found. So in terms of finding materials that are suitable for stacking onto silicon, perovskite is the hot favorite, and there's plenty of good work being done here at the University of Louisville. But it doesn't tick all the 4 boxes in that lead is the major constituent in the material, the semiconductor material, which is toxic, and legislation in the European Union would ban the use of perovskite solar cells were it not for a special dispensation for renewable energy in general that may not be permanent. And then stability is of course the big issue with perovskites. Of those, the efficiency is fine, the materials that are used can be abundant. Not always abundant in the high efficiency cells you hear about, but potentially could be abundant. But the real issue is stability. So of those 7 materials that have given over 20% efficiency, silicon is by far the most stable, and perovskites are by far the least stable. So that's where the challenge lies, trying to find a solution to improving the stability of the perovskite cell. But there's other candidates there. So with organic solar cells, which tick boxes in terms of abundancy and could in toxicity, efficiency is now getting up to 20% in the best cells, so eventually they'll get a tick there, not too distant future. So it'll only again be the stability of these organic materials. Can they be made stable enough to be combined with silicon, which is exceptionally stable, and no manufacturer will want to interfere with that stability even to get a more efficient cell. And then there's all these materials I regard of as synthetic silicon. So the thing that makes silicon a good semiconductor is it's got an average, it's group 4 of the old periodic table. So it's got average valency of 4. So if you synthesize elements from the periodic table in the right proportion, you can come up with materials that have an average valence of 4, which I describe as artificial silicon. So you've got a choice of different materials there that people are looking at, and some of them involve abundant, non-toxic materials. The main challenge with these approaches is getting the efficiency up above that 20% level. The stability should be fine, and finding abundant materials that you can combine to make these synthetic silicon materials, and then demonstrating efficiency over 20% is a challenge with them. So I personally regard that as the biggest research challenge facing photovoltaics is to either find a way of making the perovskite stable, or alternatively finding alternative materials from, perhaps this class of, perhaps organics, or perhaps this class of synthetic silicon materials that can get the efficiency boosted to above that 20% level. And then I think once you find those materials, silicon sort of does itself out of business. So you can, the first tandem cells will be stacked onto silicon because all the big manufacturers can get involved with that and market that as a product. They've got the markets already there, and they've got the resources to commercialize a new technology like that quickly and evaluate it and get it onto the market in a short period. So once you stack one cell onto silicon, you've got to do things a little bit different with the cell design. But stacking the second cell is sort of for free. There's very little extra you have to do. So I can see the industry going to a 2-cell stack on silicon. And then every time you stack a cell onto silicon, you're stealing some of the photons it would have converted, so that the contribution of the silicon to the total efficiency just goes down in proportion to the number of cells in the stack. So once you get to a 4-cell stack, the silicon's only contributing a quarter of the power it would by itself. So a 24% efficient cell will only be contributing 6%, and then you might say, well, we don't really need the silicon anymore. There's cheaper ways of depositing these materials that have probably already been evaluated in terawatt quantities in these versions stacked onto silicon. So I think silicon will do itself out of business ultimately if we can find a material that stack onto it and verify that it works just as well as silicon. So the future, I think, lies in these thin film stacks that are deposited onto a supporting superstrate, perhaps like glass. That's the end of technology, and so I'll just, got another 10 minutes, so I'll just talk about costs next. And this was a paper that was published a few years ago that just documented all the studies of costs and prices that had ever been reported for solar cells, or all the reputable ones, I think. And you're going right back to the dawn of the terrestrial industry due to the oil crises of the 1970s. And not a big difference between cost and prices, because it's typically been a very low margin industry. But you can see, like between 1980 and 2007 or 8, this is a semi-logarithmic plot. All that data fits pretty nicely to a straight line. And that just means exponentially decreasing cost. And if you fit that line and work out slope, it's 7% a year compounded cost reductions that occurred over those, nearly 3 decades. And then something happened in 2008, and we went on a completely new trajectory of much faster cost reduction. So we extrapolated the business as usual, up to about 2008, out to 2020. You would have worked out that we're going to be at $1 a watt. So those that us in solar always knew solar was going to become cheap, but we didn't know when it was going to happen. But with this change that occurred around then, we actually reached 20 cents a watt in 2020, so 5 times cheaper than business as usual. So what was all that about? This is the guy that I regard as being responsible for it all, and that's Dr. Zhengrong Shi, who's my 12th PhD student. But he was getting a bit impatient at doing research and working to get product onto the market. He wanted to jump in there and get something onto the market. And he's an Australian citizen, but he was born in China in the late 1990s. Things were opening up a bit in China in terms of opportunities for private companies and things like that. And local governments were getting to keep some of the tax from local companies, so they were keen to see local companies established in their area and things like that. So changes in China sort of suggested to him that China mightn't be a bad spot to set up his company. And that graph just sort of shows some of the information that was on the previous one, but on a linear graph, so you can see the dramatic cost reductions that have occurred since 2008. So this has the latest data. So modules are now selling this wholesale factory gate prices for 10 cents a watt, and that's a 40-time reduction in 60 years. So really massive cost reductions that I believe was triggered by Zhengrong's desire to set up in China. So with a bit of help from his friends, at our laboratories, some left our group to join him as founders of this company, and others worked part-time for him. I got to do some of the heavy lifting, cutting the ribbon at the opening ceremony and so on. So this is a really very historic moment. This was the opening of the first commercial solar cell production line in China in 2002. And Germany had sort of opened up the market by their feed-in tariff program in that era. And Zhengrong, we held the world record for cell performance then, so the cells he were making in production were as good as, if not better than anything else on offer in that era. So his product was held in high regard, and he was able to sell the product into the market that was opening up in Europe, particularly Germany and Spain and Italy. And in that era, Chinese stocks were very popular here in the US, and so some of the investment banks, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, were the two that approached Zhengrong. They were looking for companies in China that showed a bit of promise that they could list on the US exchanges, because everyone could see what a huge market China was going to be, and any Chinese stock instantly had a big asterisk against it. And so he listed on the New York Stock Exchange in 2005. So he was the first private Chinese company to list on that exchange, and it was a huge success. So he raised 400 million, which made it the biggest technology IPO of 2005. He became the first solar billionaire overnight, because only part of his company was on offer, and he still owned the majority of the company as a result of the management buyout that Goldman Sachs and other investment banks here sort of financed. And Goldman Sachs, I calculate that they made at least 200 million from the listing as well. So that created this huge avalanche of US investment banks looking for other Chinese PV companies they could pass off as clones of Suntech, which was Zhengrong's company, and then other Chinese companies, China-based companies interested in a windfall injection of cash that listing on the US exchanges would guarantee. So that just shows the next 5 listings that occurred in the US. And one of the due diligence criteria of the investment banks was have access to good technology, so all our people got gobbled up. They were either founders of these companies or chief technical officers of them, and they were part of all these early listings. So the chart on the right just sort of shows how the money was raised. So it took a year or so for the next company to get on the market, and then this avalanche of companies attracting investment from US investors. So over 7 billion was pumped into the industry before 2010, by which time the global financial crisis had wrecked this as a fundraising mechanism for these small companies. So Zhengrong started with 6 million just a few years earlier, so this 7 million injection was just orders of magnitude more. So these cashed up companies had to then try and sell their product, which caused that enormous cost reduction you saw there. They had to, the only thing they could do to sell more product was reduce their prices, which meant if they wanted to stay in business, they had to reduce their costs, it's a similar rate, which is what happened. And that's been really important to the industry. So in 2021, I haven't looked up more recently, but 6 of those 10 companies that listed between 2005 and 10 on the US exchanges were in the top 10. So, forming the backbone of the present industry. So some of them are the well-known brands dominating the industry now. Oh yeah, there's that chart again. So, that was that first dark blue region. And then the next region, the Europeans got sick of supporting this growing Chinese industry. There was no benefit to European manufacturers. So they withdrew their support for these market development programs. So the Chinese government took over responsibility for market development because their industries were starting to dominate it. So the chart on the right there, the red regions is just the total bars show the total market over the years, and the red region is the share of the market that went to China. So, you know, like over 40% of all cells sold have gone into China, which is really good for the rest of us because that means China's pumping out less CO2 than it would be otherwise. And then when our PERC came onto the market, it had its own impact. So the chart up on the right just sort of shows the same data on semi-logarithmic graph. So your straight lines are the exponential decrease. So it jumped up to 12% a year when the Chinese market development phase. Then the PERC started hitting the market, and then the incumbent technology, the 1975 technology, had to compete against this newcomer, and that caused this additional acceleration of the cost reduction that continued right up to the COVID, which slowed things down. But everything's now back onto track to this era of rapid cost reduction that we were in pre-COVID. So around 2020, these huge cost reductions started to be noticed, and people started to realise that they weren't just a flash in the pan, and next year they're going to go back to being enormously high again. So the International Energy Agency in particular, which had been quite sceptical about the role of renewables in our energy future, suddenly changed tack, 180 degrees. So they declared that solar, the new king of the energy markets, cheapest source of electricity in most countries, and now offers some of the lowest cost electricity in history. There were 3 memorable quotes from the World Energy Outlook report of 2020. And some got even more enthusiastic. So I wish I had coined this phrase, but Ramez Naam did, solar's future is insanely cheap. So I think that reflects what could well happen. Like 10 cents a watt for a module, I would have never dreamt that was possible, at the turn of the century or even later. And now, you can buy a module for 10 cents a watt. And the charts just sort of show, where the costs might go in the fullness of time, but it seems that they're still going to go down, so I'm not sure where they're going to bottom out. I've given up trying to predict, but 10 cents now, they're going to go down to 5 cents, but how far below that they can go, I don't know. And then this other crowd, climate crack, the sky's the limit. The potential of solar and wind to generate energy is about 100 times more than the energy we use now. So that, what are we going to do with all this abundant, cheap energy? New questions to be asked. So that brings me to the final bit of the talk, climate change mitigation. So I'll just finish up this quite quickly. But the IEA, as I said, had this turnaround. So their net zero by 2050 roadmap calls for scaling up of solar and wind rapidly this decade. So install as quickly as we can now is the best thing we can be doing to mitigate climate change, according to their analysis. That's just some of the data that they published there. Others have been even more enthusiastic, so they regard their forecast as being quite optimistic, but those of us in the industry know they've always underestimated the potential of solar, and that's going to continue. And so we might be looking at something like 80 or 90 terawatts installed by 2050 or a bit later there. So the blue just sort of shows the cumulative installation, and the brown shows the annual installation. So when this chart was done, it was below 300 gigawatts, but we're already 440. This year will probably be, some people say, as high as 700 gigawatts, or 0.7 of a terawatt. So we'll get up to that terawatt level pretty quickly. And then who knows what happened after that. And the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, quite surprising to me, have also been quite unenthusiastic about the role of renewables in our energy future. All their scenarios studied have only had very minute amounts considered. But in their 22 report, they looked at ways that we could reduce CO2 emissions by 2030. And the chart that you won't be able to read on the right just sort of shows all the things they looked at. And the blue regions are the really good ones because the size indicates the size of the impact, but blue means you can do it at zero or negative cost. So they're the really good ones. And I've just shown the blow up of the top region of there where the biggest blue regions are, and solar and wind, again, they come to the same conclusion. They're the best way of reducing CO2 emissions is to install them quickly. And this just sort of shows the impact of installing 1 terawatt a year. That's the graph I showed earlier, showing we're going to get to the 1 terawatt, probably in the next three or 4 years. And the chart on the right is an old one, but when I first saw it, it was quite alarming. It just sort of shows one of these graphs. It shows CO2 emissions up to 2015, then the type of trajectory you need to keep temperature rise below 2 degrees. And then they showed the plans of the 4 biggest emitters. So despite the best efforts of the 4 biggest emitters, you're running into an obvious problem around 2030. You're going to use up your total budget for a 2 degrees temperature rise, despite the efforts of these countries that they had announced to reduce their emissions. But you can see if you install 1 terawatt a year, it sort of puts you on the same type of trajectory as that 2 degree decrease. So you get up to that 1 terawatt as quickly as we can, and then you've got some hope of reining in CO2 emissions. Of course, if you can get up to 2 terawatt a year or 3, you can reduce those more quickly if you're displacing coal from electricity generation or oil from transport. That's the amount of CO2 that you'll save. This just sort of shows how it might be distributed worldwide. I won't go into the details there, except I've got Kentucky circled there. So you're good for solar according to this. 75% of your electricity could be generated by solar in 2050 in a zero carbon world. So you're not too good for wind. So you have some wind potential, but not as much as the solar potential. So that brings me to the end of the talk, but just the points I wanted to emphasize. So solar's cheap now, like according to the IEA, this is in 2020, cheapest source of electricity in history in some cases and so on. And the costs have come down since 2020. So solar is going to become cheaper. So insanely cheap sounds like a good descriptor compared to electricity generation costs in the past. New technology, and there's plenty of that in the wings, and so hopefully we can get these tandem cells working with a big impact on the prices they'll have. They'll accelerate cost reduction potential. So 10 cents a watt seemed like an impossible price to me once, but that's what you can buy PERC modules for at factory gate at the moment. And already there's been some systems installed where the in power purchase agreements where the agreed price was 1 cent per kilowatt hour. I pay 35 cents kilowatt hour in my home in Sydney, so 1 cent a kilowatt hour sounds insanely cheap already to me. And I think solar is one of the strongest weapons we have in our battle to mitigate climate change. So thank you very much for your attention. It's been a privilege to be able to speak to you today.
So we've got a few minutes to take questions. Mahendra.
A very fascinating talk about costs, especially 1 cent per kilowatt hour. I know that you're mentioning intermittent power, but how do you forecast when you go globally solar with being a base load all over? That's one question I have. The second question I want to just mention is in silicon, is there any way we can make silicon direct band gap by alloying with something?
Yeah, thanks for those two questions. Yeah, so the 1 cent is just the bare electricity generation costs. So, like LASAD publishes, 6 monthly or yearly estimated costs of electricity generation plus storage costs combined. And in their latest report, the solar plus storage came in cheaper than gas generation here in the US, which surprised me because gas, with all the fracking and so on going on, the gas generation here is quite cheap. But the solar plus storage came in below that. And interestingly, with other technologies like nuclear, Japan's plans was to go nuclear, but there you have the opposite problem. You need storage to allow the nuclear to run through the night. So for every nuclear plant that was installed in Japan, they installed half that capacity in pumped hydro storage but no one ever talks about the extra costs of storage for nuclear. So just an interesting point on your question. And the other about the direct band gap, our first idea of how to make a tandem cell would be pretty great if we could use silicon as the top cell. So, one way of doing that is use quantum confinement to increase silicon's band gap. And, I think it can make it more direct light and makes it more strongly absorbing as well. But we gave that a good shot, but we couldn't get anything interesting there. So, I'd say my answer to that would be the synthetic silicon materials, like by combining copper, zinc, tin, and sulfur together in the right proportions, you can make a direct band gap semiconductor. So I think that's probably the best approach, these synthetic silicon approaches. So thank you very much for your question.
Next question. Jacek, we come to you.
Thank you so much for the nice talk. I wanted to ask about the CO2 emissions, because I understand that this graph represents the CO2 emissions during the operation of the cells, but there is an initial emission related to the manufacturing installation and so forth. So are there any estimates of how much of these emissions will be given the scale of the installation and the volume of the cells that will be needed, how much CO2 will be emitted in the process, and how much, and also how this depends on the technology that is used for this.
Yeah, good question. So there have been numerous studies of the amount of emissions. But one thing, one point is it depends very much on what's your source of energy that you're using to make the cells is. So if you're using hydropower, for example, the emissions are only a fraction of those if you're using coal generation. So what people usually do is the average source of power for the electricity grid in the area that you're doing the calculations for. But of course, I think that can be a little bit deceptive, because what you really want to be looking at is down the track. When you've got most of your electricity being supplied by solar, what do your emissions look like then? So I think that's the real question, because most of the emissions that come from solar production come from the fact that our present electricity supplies are dirty. So as you go to a cleaner and cleaner source of electricity, the emissions associated decrease. So there's some of the processes, particularly the purification of the silicon, you need to use coal as one of the reactants within that process. So there's some things that you can't get rid of the coal from, but for most of the processing that's involved in the cell processing, if you regard it as a closed cycle, all the solar that you're pumping into the grid is going to making solar cells, for example, and like China's producing more solar electricity than they need to power their whole solar manufacturing industry, for example. So if you regarded all the power that's generated from solar in China, that being used for the manufacturing of solar, you'd get very low numbers for the CO2 emission. So they're, but despite all what I said, they're pretty low anyhow. They're not as low as wind. So wind is lower CO2 emissions than solar, but some stage in the future the two might become closer. Obviously, it's an order of magnitudes less than with coal or gas generation. So it's finite, but the figure to me is not the figure you should be looking at. It's the closed cycle figure when you're using solar to generate the energy that you use to make the solar cells. That I think is a really important one. And it reaches, you get wrong conclusions about cell technology. So cadmium telluride is the only other commercial cell material used, and it comes out very well on these present energy source type calculations, because it doesn't need as much energy in the manufacture. But if you look at the closed cycle thing, you come up with a far less sort of attractive solution. And obviously, cadmium being such a toxic metal and tellurium being such a scarce one, it sort of always confounds me that these environmental studies come up with cadmium telluride being a better choice than silicon because of the lower CO2 emissions. It just seems to me like a nutty conclusion that it's not, doesn't coincide with the reality of what's going on. So thanks for your question.
Peter?
Thank you for your talk. So what are your thoughts about other emerging solar technologies right now? Because perovskites, organic LEDs, or MPV are rising, and you mentioned just catalysts now. How do you feel like they fit into the solar space, which silicon has currently dominated?
Yeah. So, like as I said, I think there's a real need to develop these tandem cells. So I think we need to be researching these alternative materials, and it's going to be very hard, no matter how good the technology is, for a standalone technology to compete against silicon, just given the size of the manufacturing effort and the market dominance of the market players and all that kind of thing. But if you can combine it with the silicon so that these same manufacturers can employ it in that product, as I tried to explain, gradually the new technology might take over silicon once you start stacking substantial numbers of cells on top of one another. So I can see that as the path that a new technology might be able to displace silicon from the market. So so it's really important, I think, to continue to work on new materials. And perovskites would be perfect if they, if they didn't involve lead, would make them even more perfect. And if someone can find a solution to the stability problem, they're the ideal material to be stacking onto silicon, in a number of ways. So that'd be the perfect solution. But something like that is definitely needed. So keep up the good research on them.
Thank you very much for the talk. Really appreciate you coming too. It's an honor. In regards to the 10 cents per watt number with module prices, is there a floor? Will it just keep going to zero, or will it stop eventually?
Yeah, in 2002, I'm on record as saying here the floor on silicon module price was $1 a watt, and now we're 10 times lower. So you have to take whatever I say with a grain of salt. But yeah, so I think it's definitely going to get down to 5 cents a watt. But it's just amazed me how the cost has been able to be taken out of the technology. So you can buy one of these big silicon wafers now for less than $1, 50 cents or something or other. And microelectronics, you're paying thousands of dollars for the same thing. So it's just astounding the way the cost has been able to take out of the materials used there. And the production volumes are still growing. So and just volume of production is a big factor in the cost reduction. So we're definitely going to go cheaper. Maybe if I go 10 times cheaper to 1 cent a watt, maybe that'll be my next projection. But it doesn't seem impossible in view of what has already been done with the cost reduction. So if you imagine industry producing terawatts, 4 terawatts a year, which it might grow to that size, it might be down, cost something like that.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Dr. Green, again, thank you for coming here and giving us this talk. I was a follow-up question. So at 10 cents a watt, why do you think that the utilities are not just jumping all over this? Because it seems a cheaper way for them to generate energy, and I don't see them cutting the prices. So anyway, your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, here in the US, it's a little bit more difficult because you have a couple of complicating factors. Like one's the tariff situation, so we can buy our modules a lot more cheaply in Australia than you can buy them here in the US. So, like a fraction of the price, maybe half the price, something like that in Australia. And the other is in Australia, our utility is sort of like a free market. Whereas in the US there's a lot more legislative complications in the way the electricity markets work. But in Australia, the solar and the wind's just just out displacing. Like we were largely dependent on coal for electricity generation 10 years ago, but rapidly getting wiped out by the solar and wind because it's only economics that are doing it. And batteries coming down low in cost has been the other important factor. So there's a lot of angst about, we need the base load power and all this kind of stuff in Australia, but all the studies show that you can do it with solar, wind, and batteries with geographical dispersion of the power sources, like both in Australia and US are large enough countries that, when the wind's not blowing somewhere, it'll be blowing somewhere else. So, transmission is the other factor. So with those combinations, all the studies are showing you can develop a reliable supply of electricity without relying on fossil fuels. So that's the way Australia is heading, and much more quickly than anyone anticipated, largely because the grid is a commercially operated type thing, and the coal-fired power stations are having trouble making money because during the daytime the solar, which is mostly on private homes, just sort of swamps the market. Can't make any money there. They often have to pay to keep chugging along during the daytime. The electricity is negatively priced. And then in the evenings they have to make all their money, so the price skyrockets, and that encourages people to install batteries because they can see the high prices there that are going to be able to make money from batteries. So it's sort of meaning that coal will be wiped out from Australia much more quickly than anyone anticipated. So I think by the early 2030s, the coal will probably be gone. Maybe a few gas generators to provide for emergencies, that kind of thing. But the solar and the wind is really taking over there just because of the economics.
Hi, so kind of on the same vein, you talking about the cost for production of electricity going down to 1 cent per kilowatt hour and such, but obviously consumers pay through the utility and everything as well. So do you see everybody going to home solar and such and completely forgoing the entire grid because it just becomes so much cheaper to generate it? Maybe not in the most ideal conditions, but it's just so cheap that you don't have to deal with the transmission lines and everything else.
Yeah, like in Australia, we generated 20% of our entire electricity supply from solar last year, and another 12% from wind, another 5% from hydro. So we're getting up to 40% renewables. This year it'll be over 40. 14% of that 20%, or 14% of our total electricity was from residential solar. So that's expected to be the growth area, in the Australian network. So there'd be a lot more grid-sized solar going in, but the home solar is still going to grow quite healthily in Australia. And by the time the distributors and everything have added on their costs to the wholesale price of electricity, it's very easy for a home solar system to be competitive with the supply of electricity from a distributor. So, like in Australia now, you're really foolish if you can't, if you don't put a solar system on your home because it's, the energy payback. The payback's going to be 3 years, say, something like that. So it's really very short payback involved with supplying your own electricity from solar. So, so it might depend on the particular environment and rules and so on, but I think I think Australia is going to serve as a bit of an example for the rest of the world because we're facing all the grid issues that arise from having a strong dependence on renewable supplies that are intermittent and so on. So we're facing all those grid connection issues now, and solving them. They don't seem to be causing any big dramas, and but the residential solar is going to be a big part of the total energy system at the end. But I think everyone's still going to remain grid connected. So, there's a lot of home batteries going in Australia, but I don't think that's the best way of providing the storage you need. Like a having all the dispersed batteries and end-of-life disposal and all the issues that are involved in that, I think it's just a little bit too complicated. So big centralized storage things sound like a better way to go to me than having hundreds of thousands of isolated, distributed batteries that are going to reach their end of life finally, and who's going to look after them then? So, Australia is pioneering with local storage, that large storage system that's supplied in areas where a lot of solar is installed residentially. So there's been some pioneering systems like that have been installed in Australia, but that seems like a better way to go to me, if you can work out how to control, how to apportion the economics of that type of system fairly and so on.
Okay, let's give a big hand to Professor Green. And thank you all for coming to hear this talk as part of the Leigh and Conn Prize Week. And you all have a good afternoon.